Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin Nixon. I'll be talking to you all today about offensive cyber counterintelligence, which is, in fact, a mouthful. I'll be referring to it as OCCI as we go throughout the remainder of this presentation to the best of my abilities. Try and cut down on my syllable count. So just a couple of quick pointers about this presentation. This presentation is not reflective of any views held by my bosses. That includes the Department of Defense, and that also includes the United States government. You are getting stream of consciousness directly from this guy right here, not the government. I promise. So cyber rules everything around me. Those of us who are Wu-Tang fans will recognize this acronym. Counterintelligence, CI. Cyber counterintelligence, CCI. Offensive cyber counterintelligence, OCCI. Cyber threat actors, advanced persistent threat. I will be referring to CTAs and APTs interchangeably. I know there's someone out there who's going to be like, you can't do that. Too bad. By the end of this, you'll be saying WTF at the CISO ignoring CVE in your SOC if you know what I mean. So what are we going to talk about? Well, we're going to go over some basics, talk a little bit about the problem statement, what the literature says about offensive cyber counterintelligence. I'll talk to you about my hypotheses, my null and my directional hypotheses. What types of experimental and analytic methodology were undertaken. Hope we didn't forget stat class. Findings and shortcomings. Despite the fact that I am a recent graduate, I have many shortcomings. We found many insignificant p-values. We're going to talk about that. What are the implications of the findings? I don't do policy prescription, but I like to talk about policy. I like to see where people are in their policy. And then we're going to talk about what's next. So why offensive cyber counterintelligence? Why should you care? Well, this was original research conducted for my graduate thesis at Georgetown University's Applied Intelligence program. So you can blame the Jesuits on this one. I am still trying to determine whether my tuition payment actually goes towards my indulgence. I'll have to figure that one out a little later on in my life. You are not immune to the designs of your enemies. That's why you should care about OCCI. That's what really matters here. We are in an extremely dangerous geostrategic environment full of espionage. That includes corporate espionage. So the question that you should be asking yourself is whether or not your counterintelligence posture is ready. So what's the bottom line up front? Honeypots and illicit feed material. Now, I'm not talking about this handsome couple here that you may recognize from the Americans. We're talking about cyber honeypots. Assessed to be a good thing, generally speaking, and we'll talk a little bit more about what cyber honeypotting looks like. The experiment was pretty complex. I sort of overcast my net. I need to work on my experimental design. If anyone is a psychology major out there, you can feel free to tear into me after the presentation. But one thing that we did determine during the research was that timing, specifically exquisite timing, in any operation relating to cyber intelligence is critical. Or at least it's statistically significant. So take for that what you will. So I liken this to the blockbuster 2010 film Inception. Intelligence is like the first layer of a dream that sometimes sends a careening vehicle down the middle of Main Street. And that intelligence may be directed by an adversary. That intelligence operation may be directed by an insider threat. But it's being directed and it's disrupting Main Street. So what you want to do is counter that because you've acknowledged that something is happening. So we all need our own Joseph Gordon-Levitt in our lives to be able to actually do something about this intelligence operation that's being directed at us. Offensive counterintelligence lays the baseline for how we can start proactively engaging people who are trying to engage us. We know, for example, in Inception, that Ty Cobb's dream gang is coming to attack us, so we can layer a base, make a kill zone, prepare for that attack, and direct it into a place that we want it to be in. We want it to happen on our terms. They're going to attack us. We have to be ready for it. And then when it's actually happening, you are at the fourth layer, and you have to do something about it. The offensive cyber counterintelligence element is making an active effort to engage in cyber operations against an adversary that is attacking you. Countering advanced persistent threats and cyber threat actors is extremely commonplace. Everyone in this room is familiar with these acronyms. I'm sure you all have dealt with an APT or CTA at one point in your life. But a comprehensive understanding of offensive cyber counterintelligence is not understood, despite the fact that it is a critical component of cybersecurity mission sets. I like to think about counterintelligence as Aikido, where you're using the enemy's momentum against them. What does the literature say about this? Well, approach mapping is a fun way to describe scoping the problem. There's not been any formative approach mapping about what offensive cyber counterintelligence can do. So in my research, I looked at ways to specifically describe elements of offensive cyber counterintelligence relating to directing attacks, but also defining variables. And we'll talk a little bit about those variables momentarily. There's a lot out there in the open source world about counterintelligence, but generally speaking, you want to use counterintelligence to deter, detect, defeat, and exploit, and I can't say that 10 times fast. Offensive cyber counterintelligence is a little harder to get into because there's a lot you can do with it. And look at all these options that offensive cyber counterintelligence offers you as a defender behaving offensively. You can pass false material. You can erode your adversary's cyber capabilities. You can actualize influence. You may be asking yourself if I am doing okay. No, I'm not. After this research, absolutely not. But what happens when we do nothing, right? If we just have these critical vulnerabilities, these product defects, as was talked about this morning in the keynote. Well, our enemies are definitely going to act, and we all know that we have frenemies. But when we escalate, we have to think about the consequences of our actions, because all of our cyber activities can be seen through a lens of cultural contextualization. We may view something as non-escalatory. Our adversary may view it as a declaration of war. So we have to think about how we tailor our cyber operations against our adversaries. But additionally, we have to think about using conventional counterintelligence tradecraft so that our cyber intelligence activities are actually seen as such. That way they're not seen as an act of cyber warfare. So that means aliases, cover, sock puppets. These should all be pretty familiar terms, especially sock puppets, to those of us who are in the cybersecurity industry. Using cover and other ways to sort of obfuscate your involvement with an activity, also an important use. We can't keep laying here and taking it. We have to be proactive. We have to go out and engage the enemy. Electrical engineers are saying this. So if the engineers are telling us we have to fight back, you know it's getting bad. Honeypot networks, which there's a lot to be said here about what constitutes a honeypot network. But I like to think of it as creating a digital attack surface that you know is a tasty morsel to your adversary. Just as we thought about that third level of inception, where you have your snow base with killing field trained armed guards who know how to use snowmobiles with rocket launchers. That's what you want to do on your digital attack surface when you've recognized it as vulnerable or when you're preparing a digital attack surface to be vulnerable. You want it to be a kill zone. And that kill zone can mean collecting intelligence, by the way. It doesn't have to be nuking your enemy's pagers. Forensic analysis. This is everyone's favorite topic so far that I can tell from this conference. We want to learn more about what they do when they're inside of our networks. That's the whole point of integrating your digital attack surface. And then the literature says that there's not a lot of statistics about offensive cyber counterintelligence in general. And this is a problem for practitioners of cybersecurity, because if we don't know what we don't know, which is what Donald Rumsfeld called our unknown unknowns, how are we ever going to be able to stop it? So the null hypothesis, there will be no significant difference in the overall effectiveness of OCCI confrontation strategies in encountering APTs and CTAs when considering one of these 5 variables. That's the null. The directional is that at least one of those variables is going to be statistically significant. Attribution accuracy, timeliness, deterrence, changes in tactics, and repercussions on the accused entity. Did we give what we got? So this was a qualitative to quantitative content analysis. I turned words into numbers. That's all I did. Nothing too fancy there. I used an actuarial scoring matrix. Can't believe I'm saying that sentence right now. I used a case study assessment matrix. So what I did was I transliterated numbers, put them into a case study. There are some independent variables, 2 of them, which makes this a more complicated statistical experiment than if I only used 1. Timeliness of activity, changes in tactics. And then 3 dependent variables. Throwing it back to Stats 101, attribution accuracy depends on whether or not we have the tools to be able to identify what activity was directed at us. Deterrence, it depends on whether or not what we did had an impact. Repercussions on the accused entity depends on if we did anything about the activity that was directed against us. So I used a multivariate analysis of variance, and then I did intergroup t-tests, also known as an ANOVA. Now this increases the risk of a false positive, so I used Bonferroni correction. I looked at the MITRE ATT&CK framework for a wide variety of different case studies. I'm guessing no one in here has heard of MITRE ATT&CK framework. But I also looked at the diamond model, cyber kill chain, a couple of different things to try and inform data coding, try to reduce my analytic bias. This is my Likert scale. On a scale of 1 to 5, that's how I live my life. How am I feeling today? Scale 1 to 5. 5 is assessed worse, critical. Think of this as like a tornado map. When you see purple on the map, you know it's not good. Repercussions on an accused entity, if there were none, I think that's bad. But your analytic methodology may differ. You may think of this differently. I'm looking at this through the lens of some guy born in the United States a few decades ago. You all may have a completely different perspective on what is worse based off of your social experience and social learning. And then this is the moneymaker, the case study assessment matrix. Essentially what I did here was score and code down a line of variety, differing cyber attacks, assessed cyber espionage campaigns, and assessed responses by victims of these attacks, as including an offensive cyber counterintelligence angle. I don't know how many of you have heard of the OPM hack. Pretty big one. Operation Sharpshooter comes from our friends in Pyongyang. So what did I do? How did I find things? Well, the MANOVA across that entire case study assessment matrix found no statistically significant findings. Womp womp. I made a mistake. However, with the ANOVA, which is the t-tests that were occurring inside each independent variable, I found that timeliness had a p-value of 0.001, rather less than 0.001, which is extremely statistically significant. And there was also a strong correlation coefficient between deterrence, changes in tactics, and repercussions. That means that those three have some interplay associated with them. There's a relational dynamic between deterrence, adversarial changes in tactics, and repercussions done onto those adversaries. What were some of the shortcomings associated with this? Don't do a MANOVA. That's my hot take. If you can design a better experiment that has one independent variable, that would be my suggestion. Low effect sizes. So there was just not a lot to go off of based off of a high p-valuation, which again means not statistically significant. The variables that I selected might not have been the most impactful, except for the 4 that I mentioned within their specific environments. And a false negative is still possible. So I could say that there was nothing there, but something could have been there. Type 2 error. Practically, this tells me that honeypot networks are a good way to function because it's timely and actionable. We talked about the statistical significance of timeliness. A honeypot operation, a honeypot network, a digital attack surface that you have designed, you hold the keys. You manage the tempo. You know how that network functions. You have a general understanding of how your adversaries target you because you have oodles of open source intelligence to inform your understanding of how your adversaries are attacking networks. Manage your time. Direct your enemy into an area that you can manage. It gives your defenders the ability to control a cyber operation. MIT recently conducted research relating to cyber operations and found that the strategic impact of the vast majority of cyber operations that have occurred over the last 30 years have had no real substantive impact on degrading adversarial cyber intelligence activities. That is an astonishing finding when we think about all the things that we've been affected by with cyber intelligence activities and advanced persistent threats and CTAs directed at our own infrastructure. We can use sock puppets to direct attackers to our honeypot networks. Dark web environment, you have a cover persona, you direct people to attack a honeypot network that only you have become familiar with. Maybe you find a way to develop a profile on an illicit dark web marketplace through the use of your threat intelligence hunting capabilities. A sock puppet is going to be able to direct adversaries to your honeypot. So I'm telling you to do cyber cover, but that's risky. And I don't want anyone to leave here today and go download Tor and start directing people to attack places. That is not the goal here. The goal here is to start refining your cyber operator's capabilities as it pertains to developing cyber cover, obfuscation, VPNs, thinking about the fact that if you are actively being targeted, you can manage that targeting if you have sock puppets. Behavioral analytics. We know that APTs and CTAs move laterally within our networks, but our honeypot networks are going to allow for a better digital forensic analysis of exactly how lateral movement occurred. We're going to see more about how C2 was employed. And so what's next? Somebody is going to have to replicate this. Because as far as I'm concerned, it didn't go deep enough and it failed in too many places. I relied on public information, unclassified assessments, to inform my judgment. Nowhere else in any experimental research have these variables been used across an ANOVA or a MANOVA. It's 2024 and we're not thinking about statistical analysis of these things. That is unacceptable to me. I looked at 14 case studies. I was a sleepless graduate student at Georgetown when I did this. If you have a research team, why couldn't you get 30, 60 examples of this in your own case study assessment matrix with your own novel variables? You can do it. I did it for free. I paid someone to do it. You can do it. Again, I took an American-centric approach to this. There are geopolitical considerations outside of APTs, individual cyber threat actors. We have to think big picture when we're thinking about how exactly we're going to manage a whole of nation effort to undermine our cyber capabilities. Remove the Western bias. The testing environment, again, I just can't emphasize this enough. This was a complex testing environment. I cast too wide of a net. It would have been better to do an ANOVA multiple times as opposed to a MANOVA and breaking it down individually. My psychology professors are spinning at me right now, I am sure. Attributability had no statistical significance, which runs countercurrent to my understanding of how we respond to attacks, of how we respond to intelligence activities directed at us. Why is that? Why did attributability not matter? Was it bias on my part? Does someone hack us and we just know who it is? Do we use digital forensics? Do we analyze TTPs to make a determination of how they got us, how we got? What did I do wrong? I'm not losing sleep over it, but what did I do wrong? I have time for questions. I've got minutes for questions, if anyone has any.
Who's got a question? You always got one.
What would you do differently if you had to go through and redo this? Right? You said you want to make it less complex. I believe that is a good margin. Sorry, everyone can hear me anyway. I believe that where you're moving towards is a beneficial thing. And in the corporate espionage and looking for controls in regards to corporate environments, I believe that you'd be able to get a much more rich context in regards to this. But if we're going to go through and take this and apply threat modeling capabilities with this as statistical analysis and getting rid of attributability, because I don't care about who it is, I want to know why it is, right? How would you restart this?
I would remove one of the independent variables, which let me go back to that specifically. It's going to take a minute, but I would remove one of the independent variables specifically because the minute you invite a second, you start creating opportunities for false attribution activity, false attribution error. The other thing that becomes problematic with it is the lack of statistical findings implies that there's bias intrinsic to what I evaluated a variable to be. That is reflective of my experience just throughout my life, and I didn't incorporate a architect, right? A digital attack surface architect into my thinking. So I would work with a team member who had the technical knowledge outside of what I misinterpreted as being important, because you're absolutely right. Attributability matters to our boss's boss's boss. It does not matter to the line analyst, line operator. Absolutely true. Yeah.
Any other questions?
you thought about the next stages as far as you identified this? So, what are the kind of process you would produce to make this more efficient and more where people can replicate it in a efficient manner, like he was saying?
Yes, the International Association for Intelligence Education, IAFI, that's an organization that I've reached out to as a Georgetown now alum to try and get research team together to actually build out a more formulative data set where we have a population and then we have a sample from within the population. I would like this list to be 20 times the size that it is to actually get a better understanding of this experiment at a much wider scale. Because if one of these was miscoded, the outside effect that has on the wider data set poisons it. And there's a genuine concern that I have about the small size of this data set. So as I think through what I would do differently, I would like other researchers to use a similar, not exact same, type of matrix, perhaps removing one of the independent variables so we don't have to do a MANOVA again, and basically run the same experiment, just with less fat.
Sorry to bother you again. So as far as like an end product, so that operational security teams can benefit from it, what is the process you're looking for? Is making, okay, you get all the data, you produce this, larger, more, complex, more enriched data. What is the next, how are you seeing the next step of getting that to the operational team so that they can actually make use of it?
An operational liaison would be a really first good step for me, because I could have someone who, while I'm conducting the research, I could make sure that it's directed towards technical aspects of their day-to-day work. And I think that my issue is I'm looking at this through a very broad spectrum of strategic thinking and is not tactical enough. So how would I do it differently? I might change some of these variables to be more directed towards what a cyber operator deals with on a day-to-day basis. The cyber operator, to the earlier point, doesn't care about attribution accuracy, but they may care about changes in tactics. So we may want to break down within that variable, what are we talking about when we say changes of tactics? It was defined in the experiment that I ran, but it was very broad strategic thinking. So that is another way that I would like to provide assistance to operators, is to determine how would I change these tactics? How would I actually determine timeliness and whether or not it was effective? Are we talking about timeliness in a 0 to 14 day band? Are we talking about it as it relates to dwell time? As it pertains to this experiment, the timeliness of activity was specifically defined by when the activity occurred in relation to a wider geostrategic event. But that is not true for when an attacker decides, I'm going to wake up today and cause hell. So that's the other thing that I would do differently with respect to an operational team to try and feed them actionable information, is try and break down, in terms of timeliness, in terms of tactics, how can I define it so that it's more actionable by our cyber operators? I hope that answers your question.
How did you choose the cases which you ran this against?
Random sampling, but I will admit that a lot of it was randomly sampled through MITRE's attack framework. So a lot of it relates to if MITRE got involved. Yeah. But some of it does relate to cybersecurity blogs that were the first to blow the whistle on an observed event that was then carried on into the wider cybersecurity realm.
What criteria did you use to reach the different scores in each of the categories?
Well, through this, it was a vibes-based assessment. But I want to get more specific on that. if it was determined that a significant incident occurred, so a 4 under changes in tactics, that would relate specifically to whether or not there was a impact on an affected individual or a victim network's ability to function for more than a day. That's determined as significant. I would make that determination. Now, it's usually publicly reported, or in the cases of not great transparency, it can be inferred based off of disruption of services.
Any other questions?
So I'm curious, have you ever heard of a program out of Japan by a research institute? I believe they go by NICT or NICTR. They have a large-scale program called Stardust, which is a large-scale honeypot designed to catch APTs. So essentially, I foresee this as a kind of situational awareness on a widespread scale. The more organizations that can build out these kind of large-scale deception networks that mimic legitimate aspects of their organization, whatever sector that may be in, it acts as both a active collection point, but it's also that early warning system to that organization to leverage those TTPs. But at the same time, you don't want to maybe interdict or impact the enemy's activity until you can collect more long-term analysis on it. Anyhow, it is, if you're familiar with CADA and their previous research, and then the DETER project, which was partly funded by the DoD, that was kind of where I view NICTR's Stardust program as an evolution from where DETER and things fell off, at least publicly, right? But anyhow, I just recommend it just generally for this audience, if those are things you're interested in. I think there's probably a bit of pushback trying to get these things deployed in networks or organizations, of course, depending on what kind of organization you are, but it hasn't stopped, industry being creative. So
Right, absolutely. And just to add on to that point, I would say when we're thinking about what counterintelligence can do, it is frequently misconstrued as neutralizing, when in fact it could very well be exploiting, luring, influencing. So we also want to think about counterintelligence as a multi-tool, a Leatherman, because when we only look at it through deterring and defeating, we're thinking about it from the perspective of cyber warfare, and we're not thinking about it from the perspective of an intelligence operation. Intelligence operations, and that is a controversial term, but intelligence operations ought to advance your footing in some way based off of proprietary information that other people don't have access to, or that information has been generated as a result of what an activity has done. There are many other ways that you can look at an intelligence operation. That's my boilerplate understanding of it, but absolutely we want to think about in a more broad sense how counterintelligence can be applied. And I appreciate the recommendation.